They called her too old to be wanted, too worn to be chosen. At nearly 50, Clara Jean had no illusions left about love. The world had taught her her place behind a stove in someone else's kitchen, cooking for people who never looked her in the eye. But when she stepped off that stagecoach dressed in a faded calico dress and carrying nothing but a dented kettle, the lonely rancher watching from the edge of town didn't see a tired woman. He saw a lifeline. Her offer was simple, even strange. I'll cook for free forever. No one in their right mind would give away work like that, unless there was something else at stake. Folks whispered she was desperate, hiding some shame too heavy to name. The rancher didn't ask questions. Not then. But in the quiet of his kitchen, while biscuits baked and coffee brewed, he began to notice things: the way her hands shook when someone raised their voice, the way she flinched at the sound of boots on the porch, the way she never sat to eat until everyone else was served. And then there was that locked wooden box she kept under her bed, one she never let anyone touch. For months they lived like that, two people bound by an unspoken truce, sharing the same roof but never daring to cross the invisible lines between them. Until the night the past came for her. A rider from the south brought news that could ruin everything. News that explained why she'd run, why she'd sworn never to take another penny for her cooking, and why she kept that box close enough to touch in her sleep. The rancher would have to decide, let her go or fight for a woman the world had already decided wasn't worth keeping. And for Clara Jean, the choice would be even harder: trust the one man who had never tried to own her, or disappear again into the shadows she'd spent half her life escaping. Because sometimes the things we give away freely are the ones that cost us the most. What happened the night he opened that box? Why did she make that vow? And what would it cost them both to keep it? The wind had a way of talking out here. Some days it whispered through the grass like an old friend telling secrets. Other days, like this one, it scraped across the plains, rattling the porch boards, as if to remind a man how small he was. Elias Mercer stood in the doorway of his barn, one hand resting on the worn wood, the other holding a tin cup of coffee gone cold. 55 winters had carved his face into lines that matched the furrows in his fields. He'd been alone for nearly 6 years now, ever since Martha's passing. Alone had its uses, but it also had an echo. The prairie stretched in every direction, pale gold under a winter sun that seemed too far away to matter. Elias had planned to fix the south fence before dark, but when the knock came 3 slow taps against his front door, it stilled him in place. No one knocked out here. He set the cup down, walking to the house with steps measured and slow, the way a man approaches something that could change him. When he opened the door, the wind caught it pushing in the cold, along with the sight of a woman standing on his porch. She looked to be about his age, maybe 50, maybe more, but life had done its share of counting on her face. Her hair, streaked silver and chestnut, was pulled back in a loose knot. Her coat was too thin for the season, buttoned high at the neck, and in her gloved hands she carried a wooden box, small, but held as if it weighed the world. Her voice was low, almost swallowed by the wind. I was told you might need help keeping the place up. Elias didn't answer right away. The woman didn't fidget, didn't plead, just stood, steady eyes fixed on him with the kind of gaze that came from surviving more winters than she cared to count. I can work for my keep, she said. Don't need pay, just a roof and a little space to set this down. She glanced at the box. You a cook? He asked finally. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Not much of one. But I know how to make a house feel like it remembers it's a home. He looked past her. No horse, no wagon, just boot prints trailing off toward the far ridge. A long walk in this weather. Too long. You got a name, Clara Jean Whitford, she said. He stepped aside without another word. She didn't hesitate, just crossed the threshold with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned not to waste an open door. Inside, she set the box gently on the floor by the hearth, as if it might break. The fire was low. She knelt to feed it without asking, her hands sure in the work. Elias stood back, watching her in the shifting glow. She didn't look around the room, didn't ask where things were. She moved like a woman who'd learned to read spaces the way some read scripture. When the fire caught, she sat back on her heels, warming her fingers. Elias noticed the gloves were worn through at the tips, her knuckles red from cold. You'll need to know I'm not looking for charity, she said. Good, he replied, because I'm not good at giving it. For the first time, her eyes softened storm gray, with a glint of something he couldn't name. The rest of the afternoon passed without ceremony. She found a broom and swept the corners, dusted the mantel, tightened the curtain hooks in the bedroom he hadn't used since Martha. She didn't ask. She just did. When evening fell, Elias brought in a pot of beans from the barn stove and set it on the table. She ladled some into two bowls, placing one in front of him, then sat across from him without waiting to be told. They ate in silence, the kind that wasn't heavy, but wasn't easy yet either. Afterwards, she stood at the doorway to the spare room, hands folded. "I'll keep out of your way," she said. "Just tell me if there's work you need done." Elias nodded, but his eyes drifted to the box by the fire. "What's in there?" Her fingers tightened around the doorframe. "Something I only open when I know I can stay." She disappeared into the room before he could ask more. That night, as the wind scraped along the roof, Elias found himself listening for her footsteps. The cabin didn't feel as hollow, not yet warm, but not empty either. And for the first time in a long while, he wondered what might happen if someone actually stayed. Morning came, slow, spilling pale light through the kitchen window, turning the frost on the glass into lace. Elias rose before the rooster the way he always did, expecting the same cold silence that had kept him company for years. But the house was already awake. The smell of something warm, cornbread maybe, or biscuits, threaded through the air. He stepped into the kitchen to find Clara Jean at the stove. Hair loosened from its knot, a faded apron tied at her waist. The wooden box sat open on the counter beside her, and though he didn't glance inside, he caught the faint scent of lavender and cedar from whatever was tucked inside. "You're up early," he said. She didn't look back. "Some houses only wake up when there's coffee in them. Thought I'd help yours remember how." He sat at the table watching her move. She didn't rush, didn't waste a step. The skillet hissed, the bread cooled on the counter, and her hands worked with the quiet certainty of someone who'd done this in kitchens she didn't own. When she set the mug in front of him, their fingers brushed, just enough to feel the roughness of each other's work. They ate without much talk. Outside, the wind had softened, and the sound of the barn door creaking on its hinges broke the quiet. "You've got a loose hinge out there," she said between sips. "Not the only thing that's loose," he muttered, meaning the fence line, the porch step, maybe even himself. She smiled a little but didn't push. Instead, she nodded toward the far wall. "That picture of your wife, Martha." He glanced over. The frame hung a little crooked. "Yes. Pretty woman." She was. The words sat heavy between them. Clara Jean turned back to her coffee, not to pry, but because some losses didn't need witnesses, just space. By mid-morning, she'd found her way to the laundry line, thawing stiff linens in the weak sun. Elias watched from the barn, the steam of his breath clouding the cold air. Something about the sight, her sleeves rolled up, the determined set of her shoulders, pulled him back 30 years to the first time he'd seen Martha hanging wash in spring wind. But Clara Jean was different. Older, yes, and carrying some unseen weight in the way she stood. But there was a steadiness to her that didn't ask for rescue. Around noon, a wagon rattled down the distant road. The driver slowed when he saw Elias tipping his hat, then let his eyes linger on the figure by the laundry. Gossip traveled faster than a prairie fire. Elias could feel it already beginning. That night after supper, Clara Jean took the wooden box to the hearth. Elias found himself standing nearby without meaning to. She looked up at him. "You ever keep something just so you can remember who you were before everything happened?" He nodded slowly. "Got a few things like that." She lifted the lid, and for the first time he saw inside folded letters tied with blue ribbon, a small silver locket, and a worn recipe book with a frayed spine. She didn't explain them, just closed the lid again. "You open that often?" he asked. "Only when I think I might be somewhere long enough to add to it." He didn't answer, but he noticed she didn't push it back under the cot that night. The fire burned low, and the sound of the wind had changed it, no longer clawed at the walls. It moved softer now, almost like it was circling, keeping watch. And Elias realized in 2 days' time, the house already sounded different. The thaw came early that year. Snow shrank back from the fence posts, revealing the stubborn brown grass beneath, and the creek out back began to murmur again after months of silence. But inside Elias's chest, something else was stirring, something far less certain than spring. He'd grown used to the quiet of his days, to the steady rhythm of chores, and now Clara Jean's presence had bent that rhythm into a new shape. He liked it more than he wanted to admit, but he'd also seen how quickly things could vanish. One afternoon, returning from mending the north fence, Elias caught sight of her through the open barn door. She was kneeling on the packed dirt floor, mending an old harness with threads so fine It looked like spider silk in her fingers. The light caught in her hair, turning the loose strands to copper. He stopped there, leaning in the shadow. It wasn't the sight of her that tangled him up. It was the way it felt familiar, like she belonged here, though she'd been on his land for less than a week. And that scared him. That night they ate in near silence. He noticed her glancing at him as if weighing whether to speak. Finally, she set down her fork. Elias, I need to know if this is temporary. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Storm gray, steady, but with a flicker underneath, like someone bracing for a blow. I don't run a boarding house, he said slower than he meant to. But I also don't keep what isn't mine to keep. She nodded, once her jaw tight. I've been sent away before. I can't, I'm not sending you anywhere, he cut in. The words hung there, both of them unsure whether they were a promise or just a moment's comfort. A few days later, they went to town for supplies. The trip was quiet until they hit the mercantile. He caught the whispers almost immediately. Women eyeing Clara Jean, men watching Elias like he'd lost his mind. That's her staying out at Holt's place, one voice murmured just loud enough. Looks like she's earning her keep somehow, another replied sharp with meaning. Clara Jean kept her head high, but he saw the faint color rise in her cheeks. She didn't speak until they were back on the wagon, the rutted road bouncing under the wheels. I've been called worse, she said lightly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. He gripped the reins tighter. People talk when they have got nothing worth saying. She smiled at that, but it didn't reach her eyes. That night he found her in the kitchen, hands pressed flat against the counter, breathing slow, and even like she was holding herself together. You all right? He asked. I'm fine, she said without looking at him. Then softer, I just don't want to be someone's charity case, Elias. Not yours, not anyone's. And that was the heart of it, her pride, her fear of being a burden. He understood. Maybe too well. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. And inside, something between them bent under its own weight, but didn't break. The rain came hard that night, slamming against the roof in a rhythm so fierce it drowned out the usual creaks and sighs of the old house. Elias was at the table sharpening his pocket knife when he heard the low groan of the barn door straining against the wind. She's still out there, he muttered, pushing back his chair. Clara Jean had gone out before dusk to check on the hens, saying she'd be just a minute. That had been nearly half an hour ago. He grabbed his coat and stepped into the storm, the rain biting against his skin like needles. The lantern light from the barn cut a narrow path through the darkness, swaying with each gust. When he reached it, he found her kneeling in the straw, cupping a weak, shivering hen in her hands. Her hair clung to her cheeks, soaked through. She's dying, she said softly, not looking at him. You can't save every animal, Clara Jean, he said, crouching beside her. She turned, then her eyes fierce through the wet strands. It's not about the hen, Elias. The words lodged in him. She placed the bird gently back into its box, covering it with a scrap of burlap. Then she sat back on her heels, rainwater dripping from her chin. You think I don't know this is temporary? That one day I'll pack my things and leave before I wear out my welcome? I've lived my whole life being tolerated until someone better came along. He didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched between them. Men have looked at me like I was a duty, a favor, sometimes an inconvenience, never as someone they chose, not once. Her voice cracked then, but she didn't stop. And I can't, Elias, I can't do it again. I'd rather freeze in the snow than be someone's burden. The lantern light trembled with the wind shadows sliding over her face. Elias could see it then, the years of holding herself together, of building walls so high no one could scale them. He took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. Clara Jean, I don't keep people out here because I feel sorry for them. I keep them because I want them here. And right now, I want you here. Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. You think I'm doing you a kindness, he went on, but you've been doing the same for me? I just didn't realize it till now. She looked down at her hands, the faint tremor in her fingers betraying her. What kindness could I possibly be giving you? You've filled this house again, he said simply. The coffee tastes better when you pour it. The nights aren't so long with your voice in them, and every time I walk in and see you here, I remember what it feels like to come home. Something shifted in her, then like a rope pulled too tight, finally giving way. Her shoulders lowered, her hands loosened on her lap. The rain pounded harder against the barn roof, but neither of them moved. I don't know how to trust that, she whispered. Then let me prove it, he said. They stayed there for a long moment, the space between them heavy with things unsaid. Then, without thinking too much on it, Elias reached out and brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. She flinched, not away from him, but like someone startled by warmth after too much cold. Back in the house, she changed into dry clothes while he stoked the fire higher. When she returned, the flicker of the flames painted her face in golds and ambers, softening the lines time and hardship had carved there. They sat across from each other at the table, steam curling from the mugs of tea between them. For once, she didn't sit rigid. Her hands lay open on the table, palms up, as if to say she had nothing left to hide. I'm scared, she admitted. So am I, he replied. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you. The wind outside shifted, carrying the smell of wet earth and new grass. Somewhere in the distance, the creek was running fuller now, its voice stronger. For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara Jean let herself smile without reservation. Not the polite curve of lips she wore in town, but something warmer, truer. And Elias, watching her, felt something he hadn't in years, like the land after a long drought-tasting rain. That night, neither of them slept early. They stayed by the fire until the logs burned low, talking in fits and starts lapsing into comfortable silences. When she finally rose to go, Elias caught her hand gently. You can stay here, he said, as long as you want. Not until spring. Not until I get tired of the company. As long as you want. Her throat worked as she swallowed, but she only nodded. When she left the room, Elias sat there a while longer, staring into the embers, knowing something had shifted between them. Not all the way, not yet, but enough. Outside, the rain slowed to a steady whisper. Inside, the house breathed differently, like it was learning a new rhythm. And somewhere deep down, both of them knew this wasn't a temporary season anymore. The snow began to melt earlier than usual that year, leaving small rivulets running down the hillsides and carrying the scent of damp pine through the valley. For weeks, Clara Jean had lived with a quiet awareness inside her, like the feeling of holding a fragile bird in her hands. Something between her and Elias had shifted in that stormlit barn, but neither of them named it. She spent her mornings in the kitchen sleeves, rolled up, humming soft tunes, while rolling dough or stirring pots. Elias often found reasons to linger nearby, carving fence posts at the table instead of the barn, or repairing harness straps within earshot of her voice. It was a slow kind of closeness, built not on grand declarations, but on 100 quiet acts. He noticed she always left the coffee pot a little fuller than she drank, just in case he came in early from chores. She noticed he never let the fire burn low when she was in the room, even if it meant waking in the middle of the night to add wood. One afternoon, Elias returned from the market with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Got something for you, he said, setting it on the table. She raised an eyebrow. Is it flour or another bolt for the wagon? Neither. He slid it toward her. When she unwrapped it, she found a sturdy pair of leather gloves, soft-lined inside with wool. For when you're out with the hens, he explained. Your hands shouldn't be cold all winter. She ran her fingers over the stitching, the leather warm from where he'd carried it home. Elias, you didn't have to. I know, he said, his eyes holding hers a moment longer than usual. That's why I did. Her heart ached in that strange, pleasant way she'd started to recognize, like finding a spring where you'd thought the ground had gone dry. As the days grew longer, Clara Jean began walking the property with him. He'd point out the places where he'd once planned to build an extra corral, or where the apple trees used to bloom before a hard freeze took them years ago. I stopped planting after that, he admitted once, his gaze on the bare branches. Maybe you should try again, she said softly. Not everything dies the same way twice. He gave a little smile, but she could tell he was thinking about more than just trees. The first real test of their new rhythm came when Elias's grown daughter, Ruth, arrived unannounced one bright morning. Clara Jean had never met her, and the young woman's eyes swept the house quickly, taking in every change since her last visit. And you are? Ruth asked, her voice polite but guarded. Clara Jean, she answered, setting down the dish she'd been drying. I've been helping your father through the winter. Helping, Ruth repeated, glancing toward Elias. Elias didn't flinch. She's been keeping this place alive, Ruth. You'd see the difference if you'd been here before she came. Something in Ruth's expression softened, though she didn't say so outright. Over supper that night, the younger woman asked Clara Jean about the hens, the garden, even the bread recipe. By the time she left 2 days later, she hugged Clara Jean with a surprising warmth. After Ruth rode away, Elias looked at Clara Jean with quiet pride. She's not easy to win over, but she sees what I see now. What's that? Clara Jean asked, though her cheeks already burned. That you belong here. Spring came on fast. The snow melt swelled the creek and green pushed through the earth in every corner of the ranch. Clara Jean planted herbs outside the kitchen door, and Elias repaired the porch swing so they could sit in the evenings watching the sun slip behind the ridge. One night they stayed there long after dark, the air scented with lilac and pine. Fireflies winked in the pasture. I used to think my life was finished, Clara Jean said quietly. Not over in years, but over in purpose. Like I'd had all the chapters I was going to get, and the rest was just waiting. Elias turned toward her, and now she looked at him, then really looked. At the lines weather and work had etched on his face, at the steady patience in his eyes. Now I think, maybe I was just waiting for the right chapter to start. He didn't answer right away, but the way his hand found hers said enough. The next Sunday, Elias surprised her. There's a patch of ground on the west side, he said over breakfast. Always gets good sun. I was thinking maybe we could plant something there. Together, she smiled. What did you have in mind? Whatever you want to see grow. They spent the afternoon turning the soil side by side. By the time the light began to fade, the first neat rows were marked and ready. Clara Jean stood back, wiping the dirt from her hands. It's funny, she said. For years I thought planting was just work, but right now it feels like hope. That's because it is. Elias said, his voice low and sure, and in that moment she realized that the quiet, steady days she'd once thought were an ending were in truth the beginning of something entirely new. That night, as they stood on the porch watching the stars emerge one by one, Elias spoke without looking at her. You said once you didn't know how to trust this, he murmured. I hope you're starting to. She took a deep breath of the cool night air, feeling it settle into her bones. I am. The sound of the creek, the smell of turned earth, the warmth of his presence beside her, it all wove together into something she hadn't dared believe she could still have. Something like belonging, something like love. By the time they went inside, the moon was high and silver over the valley. Clara Jean paused at the door, her hand on the frame. She wasn't just stepping into a house anymore. She was stepping into her home. It was a wet spring that year, the kind where the dirt road turned to mud and the air smelled of rain for weeks on end. Clara Jean found herself waking earlier each morning, her hands eager for the rhythm of bread, kneading, her heart anchored by the quiet certainty of Elias moving somewhere in the house, but certainty she was learning could still be fragile. One morning while Elias was out repairing the southern fence, a wagon came rattling down the lane. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s climbed down, his hat low against the drizzle. Clara Jean froze when she saw his face. It had been almost 30 years. Daniel, she breathed. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You look well, Clara. Better than I expected. She tightened her grip on the dishcloth in her hands. Daniel had been the man she'd once been forced to marry after her father's death. A man who had left her the moment her body failed to give him children. A man who had called her useless with the same casual tone he might use to describe a broken wagon wheel. I'm not sure why you're here, she said evenly, though her pulse thudded in her ears. I heard you were living with some poor rancher out in the hills, he replied, glancing around the kitchen with a smirk. Thought maybe you'd want to come back. My wife passed. House feels empty. Clara Jean's stomach twisted. Empty, as if she were being offered a position, not a life. Before she could answer, heavy boots sounded at the doorway. Elias stood there, rain dripping from his coat, his eyes taking in the scene, in one long, measured glance. This man bothering you? Elias's voice was low, steady, dangerous in its calm. Daniel straightened. I'm just making an offer. She's an old acquaintance. She's not for you to offer to, Elias said, stepping inside. And she's not leaving here. Clara Jean felt something in her chest loosen, like a knot pulled free after years of tightening. But Daniel's smirk returned. You think she's yours? A woman like her? That's enough, Elias cut in, his voice sharp as a whip crack. He moved between them, his broad frame blocking Daniel's view. You can turn that wagon around and not come back. When Daniel finally left, the silence in the kitchen was heavy. Elias set his hat on the table and looked at her. You don't have to explain, he said softly, but she did. Over steaming cups of coffee, she told him everything she had never dared speak aloud, the years of small cruelties, the way Daniel had made her believe she was only worth what she could give him in children, the shame that had followed her long after he'd left. Elias listened without interruption. When she finished, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. You're worth more than he could ever see, he said. More than I can put into words. But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to show you. Her throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes. She had been waiting without knowing it for someone to say those words. The weeks after Daniel's visit carried a new undercurrent between them. Elias seemed more protective, though not possessive, always making sure she knew her place was beside him, not behind. Clara Jean, for her part, found herself wanting to do more for the ranch, not out of duty, but out of shared purpose. They repaired the garden fence together. She mended his shirts by the fire. He began teaching her how to handle the plow horse, laughing when she cursed softly at the stubborn beast. One evening, as they finished stacking hay in the barn, Elias lingered. Clara Jean, he said, I know we've been taking things slow, but I don't want to keep calling this arrangement help. I want you to know I see you as my partner. In this place, in life. The words settled in her chest like warm light. She had been offered marriage before, once under threat, once as an obligation. But this was different. Elias, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I'm not sure I know how to be someone's wife anymore. Then don't be a wife, he said with a half smile. Be yourself. That's who I chose. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Clara Jean stared at the ceiling and let the truth sink in. For the first time in decades, her life wasn't defined by what she'd failed to give. It was defined by what she could still build. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to start building it. But before she could take that step forward, news from town would force them to decide once and for all whether they were truly ready to stand together against whatever the world sent their way. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, tucked beneath the arm of the post rider, who looked reluctant to hand it over. Elias met him at the gate, glanced at the unfamiliar handwriting, and brought it inside without a word. Clara Jean was at the table peeling potatoes. She set down the paring knife when she saw his face. It's from the county judge, Elias said, sliding the envelope toward her. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The words were blunt, stamped with an official seal. Daniel had filed a claim in town, stating that she was his lawful wife, abandoned without consent, and that she must return to him or be charged with theft for taking her own few belongings. She stared at the paper, her breath caught between disbelief and the old familiar fear. He can't. He can try. Elias said, his voice low but steady. But he won't succeed. 2 days later, they rode into town together. The streets were muddy from last night's rain, the wooden sidewalks slick. People watched as they passed, some curious, some pitying, others openly whispering. At the courthouse, Daniel was waiting. His hat was tipped back, his grin smug. I see you brought your ranch hand, he said. Clara Jean's stomach churned, but Elias's presence beside her felt like an anchor. Judge Whitaker peered over his spectacles at the papers before him. Mr. Carrington, you've made a serious accusation. Do you have proof of these claims? Daniel leaned forward, oily with confidence. She was my wife. Still is. She left without cause, and she's taken up with this man. The judge looked to Clara Jean. Mrs. Carrington, do you wish to respond? Her throat was dry, but she nodded. Your Honor, I was abandoned over 20 years ago. I've supported myself since. I owe this man nothing, not my labor, not my name, and certainly not my life. Daniel laughed, but it sounded thin. You think anyone will take your word, they'll take mine, Elias said, stepping forward. His voice carried the weight of someone who rarely spoke unless it mattered. I know her worth, and I'll stand beside her in any room against any man. She is here by choice, and she's not leaving with you. Something shifted in the room like a gust of wind sweeping away stale air. The judge dismissed the claim, citing lack of evidence and the length of Daniel's absence. You're free to go, Mrs. Carrington. You owe him nothing. When they stepped outside, the sky had cleared the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. Clara Jean stood still for a moment, letting the sunlight hit her face. Elias didn't speak, just stood beside her until she turned to him. You really meant it, what you said in there. I meant every word. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat, Equal parts relief and something warmer, deeper. Then I have something to say too. He raised a brow. I'm not just staying here because I need shelter, Elias. I'm staying because this, she gestured toward the road that led home, is the first place in decades where I feel like myself again. And I want to build a life here. With you. Elias's eyes softened, the lines at their corners deepening. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small box, worn smooth from years of carrying it. My mother's wedding ring, he said. I was saving it for the right time. Guess that's now. Clara Jean's breath caught. The band was plain silver, but it gleamed in the sunlight. You sure? She whispered. I've never been more sure. That evening, they returned to the ranch as the sun dipped low, painting the fields in gold. She cooked stew while he mended a harness at the table. No grand ceremony, no witnesses, just the quiet knowledge that they had chosen each other freely. After supper, Elias poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one toward her. To new beginnings, he said. She smiled, lifting her cup, and to finally being home. Outside, the frogs had begun their evening chorus. The air smelled of rain and turned soil. And somewhere deep in the house, in the bones of the walls, something shifted like an old structure, settling into the comfort of being lived in again. Years from now, the neighbors would remember that spring as the one where Elias Holt began smiling more, where Clara Jean planted roses along the fence line and they bloomed wild every summer after, where the ranch, once quiet with loneliness, learned how to hold laughter again. Because sometimes love doesn't ride in young and blazing. Sometimes it comes slow, steady like rain after drought, soaking into the ground until you realize the roots have been there all along. And for Clara Jean, it was never about finding the life she'd lost. It was about growing the one she'd always deserved. In the end, it wasn't the meals Clara Jean cooked or the chores she finished that made the ranch feel like home again. It was the quiet moments, the way she'd hum while hanging laundry, the way she listened without hurrying, the way she looked at a man as if he were more than what the world saw. The rancher, once convinced his life was meant to be lived in silence, found himself speaking more. Not many words, just the right ones. And when he finally told her, "You've made this house feel alive again," she smiled, not the smile of a woman who'd earned her place, but of one who'd finally stopped needing to. Life out here would never be easy. There would still be long winters, hard days, and moments when the past crept in like a cold wind under the door. But now they'd face it together, and that made all the difference. Friends, sometimes the most valuable thing we can give isn't our labor, our skill, or our time. It's simply our presence. To be steady, to be kind, to stay. If you've ever found love, friendship, or even peace later in life, you know, it's never too late. What about you? Would you like to hear more stories like this, where second chances come quietly but change everything? If you do share this story, leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, so you won't miss the next one.